The Indian Ocean is vast in a way that maps fail to convey. Between the east coast of Africa and the Indian subcontinent stretch immense expanses of water where, in the late 19th century, ships could sail for weeks without sighting land. It was a strategic ocean vital to the British Empire, a route of trade, troops, and global influence. And it was there that a Royal Navy ship's story became wrapped in uncertainty. HMS Blenheim was a protected cruiser of the Edgar class, launched in 1890. Classified at the time of her construction as a first-class cruiser, not third-class in terms of inferiority, but part of an earlier generation that, decades later, would be considered outdated in the face of rapid naval technological evolution. She served at various imperial stations. Designed for long ocean patrols, strategic presence, and the protection of trade routes, she had considerable range and the ability to operate far from major bases. She symbolized Britain's global reach. But at the dawn of the 20th century, naval warfare was changing rapidly. New types of ships emerged. Armor improved. Engines became more powerful. Although still operational, HMS Blenheim no longer represented the cutting edge of the fleet. In 1901, during the Second Boer War, Blenheim was involved in operations in the Indian Ocean and the Southern African region, transporting troops and supporting strategic movements. It was a less glamorous role than fleet battles, but essential to imperial logistics. It is within this context that her story takes on a certain ambiguity. Unlike dramatic sinkings marked by explosions and eyewitness accounts, the case of Blenheim is not tied to a single catastrophic event widely documented. There was no torpedo strike, no decisive naval engagement that destroyed her. The mystery, such as it is, lies more in the lack of a dramatic final chapter and in how ships of her generation were gradually withdrawn from service under circumstances that were often unremarkable, and not always vividly preserved in popular memory. Blenheim continued serving after her early missions. Eventually, like many ships built in the 1890s, she became obsolete as naval technology advanced. The turn of the century ushered in the dreadnought era, fundamentally redefining naval power. Ships like Blenheim were relegated to secondary roles. And as with many cruisers of her time, she was eventually sold for scrap in 1907. What makes her story compelling, however, is not a dramatic disappearance. It is the reality of how imperial ships operated in remote regions, far from public scrutiny, facing storms, long passages, and relentless wear. The Indian Ocean was not a theater of intense confrontation like the North Sea during the First World War, but it was still a demanding environment. Monsoons, tropical cyclones, and vast distances between safe ports posed constant challenges. Steam-powered ships of the 1890s required continuous maintenance. Coal had to be replenished frequently. Mechanical systems were sensitive. Crews endured extreme heat in tropical waters. Routine life was exhausting. If we speak of mysterious disappearance, historical precision matters. HMS Blenheim did not suddenly vanish in battle in the Indian Ocean. She had a lengthy career and was ultimately decommissioned and sold for scrap in 1907. But this allows us to explore something perhaps more profound. Ships like Blenheim represent a transitional generation of naval warfare, between eras. Before dreadnoughts. Before total submarine warfare. Before naval aviation. They were instruments of imperial projection, navigating vast oceans where incidents could easily become legend if documentation was scarce. The absence of a dramatic final event does not mean the absence of danger. Every passage across the Indian Ocean at the end of the 19th century carried real risks. Mechanical failure, violent storms, geographic isolation. If something happened far from major routes, information could take weeks to circulate. And in an age before instantaneous communication, distance itself could create the illusion of disappearance. To understand what it meant to serve aboard HMS Blenheim, one must set aside the modern image of automated ships and imagine a world driven by coal, steam, and rigid discipline. Launched in 1890, Blenheim was part of the Edgar class, protected cruisers designed to patrol the vast maritime territories of the British Empire. They were not ships of the line, but they were essential for ensuring naval presence and authority in distant regions. The Indian Ocean was one of those regions. Vital trade routes passed through it. India, East Africa, the Middle East, all connected by sea corridors that had to be protected. Blenheim was not merely a warship, she was a floating symbol of empire. Life on board was demanding. Tropical heat penetrated the metal hull. The engine rooms, powered by massive coal-fired boilers, were suffocating environments. Stokers worked covered in soot, shoveling coal relentlessly to maintain proper steam pressure in the engines. Coal was the ship's lifeblood. Without it, the cruiser was motionless. And coaling in the late 19th century was a heavy, time-consuming operation. Entire crews participated, often in improvised ports or remote anchorages. Every passage across the Indian Ocean required careful logistical planning. The monsoons could turn calm seas into violent expanses. Strong winds, high waves, and torrential rain tested both the ship's structure and the crew's discipline. A cruiser like Blenheim was sturdy but not invulnerable. Indian Ocean storms were known for their sudden intensity. And when a ship was hundreds of miles from the nearest port, any mechanical failure became a serious threat. Although Blenheim did not suddenly vanish in combat, her career unfolded during a period of rapid technological transition. The 1890s marked the height of the protected cruiser era. But in 1906, the launch of HMS Dreadnought would redefine naval power entirely. Ships like Blenheim became, almost overnight, relics of a previous age. That technological transformation is essential to the story. At the time of her launch, Blenheim represented significant advancement. She possessed respectable armament, oceanic range, and sufficient speed for patrol and trade protection missions. But naval evolution was relentless. Within less than 2 decades, new classes were faster, more heavily armed, and better protected. The naval arms race among European powers was accelerating. Blenheim continued to serve, but each passing year placed her further from the technological front line. During the Second Boer War, which began in 1899, Blenheim played a logistical support role, transporting troops and assisting operations in southern Africa. This highlights an important point. Warships do not serve only in direct combat. They sustain campaigns, ensure mobility, and project strategic presence. The Indian Ocean in that context was an essential route for reinforcements and supplies. And every voyage carried implicit risk. Not the risk of torpedoes, submarine warfare had not yet reshaped naval conflict, but the risk of technical failure and isolation in open seas. If a ship suffered structural problems far from major routes, communication could take days or weeks. The idea of mysterious disappearance often arises from such geographic and temporal distance. Historically, however, Blenheim did not vanish without record. She met an administrative end, not a dramatic one. In 1907 she was sold for scrap. And here lies perhaps the most interesting point. Not every ship ends in explosion or epic battle. Many end quietly, decommissioned, dismantled, forgotten. But the absence of a spectacular sinking does not diminish historical significance. Blenheim represents an intermediate phase of British naval supremacy, a period when the empire depended on cruisers dispersed across the oceans to maintain global control. These ships operated far from the metropole. Crews lived months away from home. Officers and sailors faced heat, storms, tropical diseases, and the monotony of long patrols. The Indian Ocean was not merely a geographic setting, it was a constant test of human and mechanical endurance. The ocean's silence could be deceptive. Danger did not always come from a visible enemy. Sometimes it came from slow corrosion, structural fatigue, accumulated wear. And that is an essential part of naval history that rarely receives cinematic attention. HMS Blenheim did not sink mysteriously in battle. But she sailed in waters where many others did disappear throughout history. She belonged to a generation of cruisers that sustained the empire at the height of its geographic reach. And her quiet end symbolizes something larger: how quickly technology can transform power into obsolescence. A ship that represented modernity in 1890 became outdated in less than 2 decades. That silent transition may be more revealing than any explosive shipwreck. Naval power does not vanish only in battle. It also vanishes when the world changes. If we truly want to understand what HMS Blenheim represented, we must look beyond the idea of a dramatic disappearance and dive into what naval warfare actually was at the end of the 19th century. Blenheim was born in an era when the British Empire depended on the sea as its vital artery. Before aviation, before modern telecommunications, before total submarine warfare, it was ships like her that ensured the empire remained connected. The Indian Ocean was not merely a body of water between continents. It was a strategic corridor. Troops, coal, ammunition, supplies, and above all, political authority, moved across it. The presence of a British cruiser anchored in a distant port was not merely military, it was a message. And Blenheim was one of those floating messengers. But operating along those routes required more than armament. It demanded continuous endurance. Voyages were long. Coal had to be replenished regularly, often in improvised colonial ports. Tropical heat wore down both men and machinery. Saltwater corrosion was a constant enemy of the steel hull. Every day at sea was a negotiation with the environment. Sailors faced prolonged monotony, interrupted by moments of sudden tension during tropical storms. Routine included gunnery drills, relentless maintenance, and constant vigilance. The sea was not a battlefield every day, but it was an environment that required permanent readiness. Over time, Blenheim gradually became part of a generation overtaken by technological innovation. The turn of the century brought rapid changes. More efficient engines, larger caliber guns, more sophisticated armor. The concept of the protected cruiser began to lose ground to more powerful warships. And then came 1906. The launch of HMS Dreadnought radically transformed naval warfare. Earlier ships, even relatively recent ones, became obsolete almost overnight. Blenheim did not sink under torpedo fire. She was overtaken by time. And that is a silent, yet profound, form of disappearance. When she was finally withdrawn from service and sold for scrap in 1907, there were no dramatic headlines. No high seas tragedy. There was administrative closure. But that does not make her story insignificant. Ships like Blenheim sustained the empire during decades of global expansion. They operated in distant waters, often far from public attention. They secured trade routes, transported troops, and embodied British naval authority in strategic regions. The Indian Ocean was witness to that constant presence. And although Blenheim did not vanish mysteriously in battle, she sailed waters where countless other vessels, merchant and military alike, were lost to storms, structural failures, or accidents throughout history. The mystery here is not in a final explosion. It lies in historical transition. There is something deeply human in that transition. Crews who served aboard ships considered modern in 1890 saw, in less than 2 decades, their vessels rendered antiquated. Men who believed they stood at the technological forefront realized that naval development was advancing faster than they had imagined. Blenheim symbolizes that intermediate moment between eras. Between the confident empire of the Victorian age and the accelerating arms race that would culminate in the First World War. Between the protected cruiser and the dreadnought. Between coal-fired propulsion and an era beginning to experiment with new forms of power and combat. Perhaps the true meaning of HMS Blenheim's story is this. Not every ship must sink dramatically to represent historical change. Some disappear gradually from relevance. Some become part of technical memory, replaced by more advanced generations. Yet each one carried real men, faced real seas, and sustained real strategies. The Indian Ocean remains vast. Imperial routes have changed. The British Empire no longer exists. But Blenheim endures as a symbol of a specific phase in naval history, a phase in which constant presence mattered as much as battle. And sometimes, the quietest disappearance is the one caused by the passage of time. When we think about the end of a warship, the image that usually comes to mind is dramatic. Explosions, fire, columns of smoke on the horizon, men running across a tilting deck. But the end of HMS Blenheim was different. And for that very reason, it reveals something deeper about naval history. She did not vanish beneath the waters of the Indian Ocean on a stormy night. She was not torpedoed in an epic battle. She was not lost in a cyclone. What happened to her was something quieter, and, in a sense, more inevitable. She was surpassed. During her years of service, Blenheim crossed the Empire's strategic routes. She patrolled tropical waters. She transported troops during the Second Boer War. She represented British presence in distant ports. Her crew lived under the heat of the Indian Ocean, worked in suffocating engine rooms, endured unstable seas and long periods far from home. Life on board was disciplined and repetitive. The day began with rigorous deck cleaning, inspections, equipment maintenance, gunnery drills. The hierarchy was clear. Officers supervised, sailors executed, stokers fed the boilers that kept the ship in constant motion. Every mile sailed was sustained by direct human effort. Coal had to be loaded manually. Soot clung to clothing and lungs. The heat in the engine rooms was intense. In tropical waters, temperatures below deck could become nearly unbearable. And yet it was routine. Blenheim was not merely a machine of war. She was a floating community with hundreds of men living in confined space, bound by strict discipline and the rhythm of the sea. But the naval world changed rapidly. The end of the 19th century was marked by unprecedented technological acceleration. New artillery systems, improved armor, more efficient engines. And then, with the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906, everything that had come before suddenly seemed outdated. Ships that represented modernity in 1890 became obsolete little more than a decade later. Blenheim fell victim to that transition. Not to a torpedo, but to time. She was not inadequate for her era. On the contrary, she was built to meet the strategic needs of a global empire. But when the logic of naval warfare changed, she belonged to another age. In 1907 she was sold for scrap. Her hull, which had faced tropical seas and storms, was dismantled. Her steel plates were reused. Her guns were removed. What had once symbolized imperial presence became recycled material. That is the fate of most warships. Few become monuments. Most disappear quietly. Yet there is symbolism in that. Blenheim sailed the Indian Ocean at a time when the British Empire stood at its height. She was part of the network that maintained connections between continents. She was a visible expression of power. When she was withdrawn from service, the world stood on the edge of an even greater transformation. The naval arms race that would culminate in the First World War. More powerful ships would be built. Submarines would become decisive weapons. Naval warfare would come to include mines, torpedoes, and eventually aviation. Blenheim belonged to the earlier phase. Her story reminds us that naval power is never static. It evolves, replaces, and abandons what once seemed essential. Perhaps the true mystery of HMS Blenheim is not a sudden disappearance, but the way entire ships, with their crews, routines, and histories, can simply fade from collective memory. She did not sink in battle. She did not headline a famous disaster. She did not generate international headlines. But she sailed strategic seas, sustained campaigns, represented an empire. And then she vanished from active history, replaced by a more modern generation. That too is part of military history. Because not all transformations arrive with explosions. Some arrive with administrative silence. The Indian Ocean remains vast. Trade routes have changed. The empire Blenheim served no longer exists. But the story of this cruiser endures as a symbol of an intermediate era, between the romance of sail and the industrial brutality of the First World War. She sailed when the empire seemed permanent. She was dismantled when the world was already accelerating toward even greater conflicts. And perhaps that is the true narrative. HMS Blenheim did not mysteriously disappear in the waters of the Indian Ocean. She disappeared in the transition between eras. And sometimes the most profound change is not the one that explodes. It is the one that replaces. There is something almost invisible in the story of HMS Blenheim, and perhaps that is precisely what makes it so meaningful. She did not end in a blaze of fire. She was not the headline of a disaster. She did not vanish without a trace in the Indian Ocean. But she sailed in a period when the world seemed stable, before realizing it stood on the brink of irreversible transformation. In the late 19th century, the British Empire relied on a global network of ships like Blenheim. They were instruments of presence, projection of power, and protection of trade routes. The Indian Ocean was a vital corridor between Britain, India, and East Africa. Maintaining that connection meant keeping the empire cohesive. And it was in that ocean that cruisers like Blenheim operated for months at a time. Life on board was rigid and relentless. Officers enforced constant discipline. Sailors cleaned, adjusted, inspected. The boilers demanded continuous feeding with coal. Steam kept the ship alive. In the Indian Ocean, the heat was nearly constant. Heavy air, high humidity. Rust appeared quickly if not constantly fought. Work never truly stopped. Even in times of relative peace, the ship had to remain ready. Because the empire could not appear vulnerable. Yet history repeatedly shows that no system of power remains static. While Blenheim patrolled tropical routes, naval engineers were already developing designs that would render her generation obsolete. The pace of naval innovation accelerated. Larger guns. Thicker armor. More powerful engines. When HMS Dreadnought was launched in 1906, it completely redefined global naval balance. Earlier ships became outdated almost instantly. Blenheim, modern when launched in 1890, now seemed like a relic of another phase. This obsolescence did not arrive with alarm. It arrived through technical comparison. And the administrative decision was clear: withdraw from service. In 1907 she was sold for scrap. Her hull dismantled. Her metals reused. Her silhouette disappearing not beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean, but in the yards of demolition. But that does not mean she was irrelevant. On the contrary. Ships like Blenheim sustained the empire at its territorial height. They operated in distant seas where each port visit reinforced political authority. They transported troops, maintained strategic presence, and secured commercial routes. They were an essential part of the mechanism that kept the United Kingdom a dominant maritime power. And this is an important point in the historical narrative. Not all ships that shape the world are those that sink in battle. Some shape the world simply by being there. The Indian Ocean, where Blenheim operated, remains one of the most strategic regions on the planet. Today, modern vessels cross its waters with technology unimaginable in the 19th century. Satellites monitor routes. Turbine engines have replaced coal-fired boilers. Yet the principle remains. Control of the sea means global influence. Blenheim was part of that logic in her time. And when she was dismantled, it was not only a steel hull that disappeared, it was a phase of Victorian imperial mindset, which believed that cruisers scattered across the globe were sufficient to maintain permanent stability. The 20th century would prove otherwise. The First World War would demonstrate that technology could rewrite the rules rapidly. Submarines, mines, and total war at sea would profoundly alter the balance. Blenheim did not live to see that. But she belonged to the generation immediately preceding the rupture. Perhaps that is the true narrative strength of HMS Blenheim. She is not remembered for a spectacular end. She is remembered as a representative of an era that ended quietly. And sometimes in naval history, silence speaks louder than explosion. If we look closely, the true historical weight of HMS Blenheim does not lie in a single dramatic event, but in the prolonged routine of imperial presence in one of the most strategic oceans in the world. The Indian Ocean at the end of the 19th century was not an empty space. It was a vital axis of the British Empire. Troops from India, supplies bound for Africa, official correspondence, and goods that sustained entire economies all moved across its waters. To control the Indian Ocean was to ensure imperial cohesion. And control meant presence. Ships like Blenheim were not merely machines of combat. They were instruments of political visibility. When a British cruiser anchored in a colonial port, it symbolized order, authority, and the capacity for immediate military response. But that presence carried a constant human cost. Life aboard was marked by strict discipline. The day began early. Deck scrubbing, weapons inspection, cable checks, continuous boiler maintenance. Coal had to be stored, moved, and fed into furnaces. Every passage depended on tons of fuel. The process of coaling, refueling with coal, was exhausting. Crews worked covered in soot, passing baskets of coal hand to hand. The heat in the engine rooms could reach suffocating levels, especially in tropical waters. Blenheim was powered as much by human effort as by steam. And the Indian Ocean did not make things easier. The monsoons could transform the sea within hours. Strong winds raised heavy swells. The steel hull was repeatedly tested. Equipment had to withstand constant salt corrosion. No visible enemy was required for danger to exist. The environment itself was a permanent adversary. During the Second Boer War, Blenheim was employed in support roles, including troop transport and strategic presence along the routes connecting Britain to southern Africa. It was not traditional naval warfare, but it depended profoundly on maritime control. Every soldier deployed, every supply delivered, passed along routes protected by ships like her. The sea was the imperial highway. And Blenheim was one of its guardians. Yet while these ships carried out their missions, technology advanced at accelerating speed. The late 19th century was marked by continuous innovation in naval engineering. Armor grew thicker, guns more powerful, engines more efficient. When launched in 1890, Blenheim represented modernity. She was a protected cruiser with significant range, suitable for long oceanic operations. But within less than 2 decades, that modernity began to seem limited. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 completely redefined the standard of naval power. Earlier ships, even though still functional, were now seen as obsolete compared to the new generation of battleships. Blenheim continued sailing. But the world around her was changing. That change was not visible on deck. Sailors continued their daily tasks. Officers maintained discipline. Guns remained aligned. Yet strategically the paradigm was shifting. It is important to understand that obsolescence is not failure. It is the natural consequence of technological evolution. Blenheim did not fail in combat. She was not defeated. She simply belonged to an earlier generation. And when the time came, she was withdrawn from service. In 1907 she was sold for scrap. The dismantling of a warship is almost an anticlimax in historical terms. Steel cut apart, structures taken down, components reused. There is no grand ceremony. Only administrative closure. But every steel plate carried history. Every deck had supported men on long patrols. Every engine room had witnessed the physical labor that kept the ship alive. The Indian Ocean remains a strategic corridor in the 21st century. But the ships that cross it today are radically different. Digital systems, modern engines, satellites, and radar have replaced coal and lookouts and masts. Blenheim belonged to a specific moment, the height of Victorian imperial confidence, just before the naval arms race that would culminate in the First World War. She sailed in an era that believed in the permanence of British maritime dominance. But history would show that no dominance is permanent. Ships age. Technologies change. Empires transform. And the oceans remain. To fully understand the significance of HMS Blenheim, one must imagine the slow, steady rhythm of naval presence at the end of the 19th century. It was not an era of constant clashes between great fleets, it was an era of continuous vigilance. The Empire did not need to fight battles every day. It needed to be there every day. Blenheim was part of that constant presence. Built as an Edgar-class protected cruiser, she was designed for long distances. Her range was one of her greatest strengths. In a world where naval bases were scarce and scattered across distant continents, the ability to sail for weeks without immediate resupply was strategic. But that autonomy came at a cost. The heart of the ship lay in her coal-fired boilers. To maintain proper pressure and steady speed, tons of coal were consumed daily. Work in the engine rooms was physical, repetitive, and exhausting. Stokers labored in extreme heat, shoveling coal into furnaces with little interruption. The ship's rhythm depended on the rhythm of those men. On the upper deck, life followed rigid discipline. Morning inspections, gunnery training, maintenance of rigging, constant cleaning to prevent corrosion. The marine environment corrodes metal quickly. Every bolt required attention. The Indian Ocean added its own challenges. During the monsoon seasons, the sea could become unpredictable. Heavy waves struck the hull repeatedly. Crosswinds demanded constant navigational adjustments. In tropical waters, storms could form rapidly, reducing visibility and testing control of the vessel. And when Blenheim operated near African or Indian coasts, she faced relentless heat. The interior of the ship trapped temperature. Ventilation was limited. Fatigue accumulated. No visible enemy was required for tension to exist. The environment itself was enough. Strategically, the Indian Ocean was essential for the connection between the United Kingdom and India, the jewel of the imperial crown. Troops, supplies, and official correspondence regularly crossed those waters. Blenheim and similar ships ensured that no rival power interfered with these routes. The mere presence of a British cruiser had a deterrent effect. She did not need to fire her guns. Her silhouette on the horizon was message enough. Yet while this presence maintained imperial stability, European powers were investing heavily in naval innovation. Germany expanded its fleet. France modernized its ships. The technological race intensified. Blenheim represented the generation immediately preceding the full explosion of that naval arms race. She was the product of a naval mindset that still believed protected cruisers could balance speed, range, and firepower effectively. But the logic of industrial warfare was advancing rapidly. It is striking that many ships of this generation were withdrawn from service before facing large-scale direct conflict. Technological evolution moved so quickly that some vessels became obsolete before they could prove their worth in battle. Blenheim was not destroyed by an enemy. She was overtaken by concept. When HMS Dreadnought redefined the naval standard in 1906, it established a new hierarchy. Earlier ships, even those still operational, became secondary. Blenheim was sold for scrap in 1907. The decision was not dramatic. It was pragmatic. Yet every administrative decision carries historical implication. Because when a ship is dismantled, part of an era is dismantled with it. The men who served aboard her may not have fully grasped the magnitude of that transition. For them, the ship was tangible reality: steel, steam, discipline, routine. The idea of obsolescence was distant, formulated in strategic offices. On deck, the day began and ended as always. But history was moving. The 20th century would bring submarine warfare, massive naval blockades, escorted convoys, carrier aviation. War at sea would become more lethal, more technological, more industrial. Blenheim belonged to the moment just before that transformation. She sailed when the empire seemed permanent. She was dismantled as the world was already accelerating toward far greater conflicts. And the Indian Ocean, vast and silent, witnessed that transition without fanfare. When HMS Blenheim crossed the Indian Ocean, she carried more than steel, coal, and guns. She carried an idea. The idea that the British Empire was sustained by the sea. At the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the Royal Navy was not merely a military force, it was a structure of global connection. Every naval station, every cruiser deployed in distant waters, formed part of a network that kept trade, politics, and imperial authority functioning as an integrated system. Blenheim was one of the nodes in that network. Her steel hull may not have remained the most modern in the fleet for long, but her presence was strategic. She operated in a region of immense distances and slow communications. A request for reinforcement could take weeks to be answered. An incident in a colonial port required immediate local response. That meant the ship had to be ready. Life aboard reflected the rigid social structure of Britain at the time. Officers had separate quarters, distinct meals, and clear privileges. Sailors shared communal spaces on the lower deck, where hammocks were slung at night and stowed away in the morning. Space was limited. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Routine created psychological stability. Fixed meal times, watch rotations, regular drills. Predictability was a way of maintaining order in an isolated environment. But the isolation was real. Months away from England. Letters took weeks to arrive. News was fragmented. The outside world felt distant. In the Indian Ocean, that sense of distance was magnified by the vast horizon. Entire days could pass without sighting another vessel. Sea and sky merged into a continuous line. For many sailors, that oceanic solitude was the hardest part of service. Technically, Blenheim represented the balance between speed and range that British naval doctrine valued in the 1890s. She was not a heavily armored battleship, but she had sufficient endurance for extended patrols. Her armament was adequate for confronting smaller vessels or imposing authority in colonial waters. But naval doctrine evolves alongside technology. As rival powers invested in larger and more heavily armed ships, the urgency of modernization increased. The Anglo-German naval arms race in the early 20th century intensified rapidly. Blenheim, though still operational, no longer represented the cutting edge of that competition. She became part of the second line, useful but not decisive. Such a shift in status does not occur dramatically. There is no precise moment when a ship ceases to be relevant. It is a gradual process. First, new units take on priority missions. Then older ships are reassigned. Finally, they are withdrawn. Blenheim followed exactly that path. There is also a symbolic dimension. Warships are more than machines. They are physical expressions of national power. When a ship is launched, there is ceremony, celebration, political speech. It embodies expectations. When it is dismantled, there is rarely the same ritual. The end is quiet. Yet every steel plate removed carries marks of seas crossed, storms endured, men who served. Blenheim sailed when the British Empire seemed unquestioned. Her retirement coincided with a world moving toward increasingly intense rivalries. Only a few years after her dismantling, Europe would plunge into the First World War. Naval conflict would reveal far more brutal dimensions. Submarines, economic blockades, massive industrial confrontations. Blenheim did not take part in that war. But she belonged to the period immediately before it, when imperial confidence still prevailed. The Indian Ocean, the theater of her patrols, would remain strategic throughout the 20th century. During both world wars, it would once again serve as a vital route. The logic of maritime control would remain valid. But the ships would be different. Turbine engines would replace coal-fired boilers. Radio communications would reduce isolation. Naval aviation would expand the reach of surveillance. Blenheim represents the moment when all of that was still to come. She sailed at the frontier between tradition and modernity. And that frontier is essential to understanding the evolution of naval power. If we look even deeper into the history of HMS Blenheim, we see that she belongs to a very specific moment in British naval engineering. The Edgar class was conceived at a time when the Empire needed cruisers capable of operating far from Europe, protecting trade and demonstrating strategic presence in distant waters such as the Indian Ocean. These ships were not designed to face battleships in a line-of-battle engagement. They were designed for mobility, range, and versatility. Technically, they possessed sufficient protection for the threats of their time, but they prioritized ocean-going endurance, something essential for an empire that spanned continents. Blenheim displaced thousands of tons, carried significant armament for colonial patrol duties, and had a robust structure suited for long voyages. Her speed was respectable by the standards of the 1890s. On paper, she was an efficient tool for the type of mission British strategy required at that moment. But there is something fascinating about how quickly military technology can age. At the moment of her launch, she represented modernity. In little more than 15 years, she already seemed part of an earlier generation. This reveals the accelerated pace of naval transformation at the turn of the century. The introduction of larger caliber, longer-range guns fundamentally altered the logic of naval combat. The standardization of heavy armament and dreadnoughts eliminated the older mixed-caliber arrangements typical of protected cruisers. The concept of all-or-nothing armor began to take hold. Blenheim belonged to the period immediately before that doctrinal rupture. She was the product of a strategy that valued global dispersion and control of trade routes more than direct confrontation between major fleets. In the Indian Ocean, this made sense. The primary threat was not a powerful enemy fleet stationed in the region, but interruptions to commercial flow or instability in colonial ports. The presence of a British cruiser was often sufficient to reaffirm authority. But the world was changing. The rise of Germany as a naval power introduced a new balance of forces in Europe. The naval arms race intensified. Massive investments were directed toward more modern battleships. War increasingly came to be imagined in industrial terms, not merely imperial ones. Blenheim continued to operate, but global strategic logic was shifting from colonial patrol to preparation for great power confrontation. That shift redefined priorities. Older ships, even if still functional, came to be seen as secondary. The human experience aboard mirrored this silent transition. Sailors may have heard rumors of new ships being built in Britain. Officers followed technical reports. But routine remained unchanged. Constant maintenance, watch duty, discipline. The contrast between the slow rhythm of life at sea and the rapid technological change unfolding in European shipyards is striking. While men shoveled coal by hand into furnaces, engineers were already designing more efficient systems. While lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars, advances in communications were beginning to reduce naval isolation. Blenheim sailed in an era that still depended heavily on direct human physical effort. And that is essential to understanding her historical significance. When she was finally withdrawn from service and sold for scrap in 1907, it was not because she had failed. It was because the paradigm had changed. Naval history is not made only of decisive battles. It is made of gradual replacements, of ships that complete their cycle and give way to others. Blenheim completed her cycle. But the Indian Ocean she patrolled would remain strategic in the decades that followed. During the First World War, it would once again be a vital route. During the Second World War, it would face submarine and aerial threats. The ships changed. The logic of maritime control remained. If there is one lesson in the story of HMS Blenheim, it is that disappearance does not always come with explosions or violent storms. Sometimes, it happens almost imperceptibly, in the transition between eras. Blenheim was not swallowed by the Indian Ocean on a monsoon night. She was not lost in a tropical cyclone. She was not destroyed by enemy torpedoes. Her disappearance was different. She disappeared from strategic relevance. During her years of service, she crossed vital imperial routes. She patrolled distant seas. She transported troops. She represented British authority in colonial ports. She was part of a larger mechanism that kept the British Empire connected through the sea. In the Indian Ocean, her hull cut through waters that sustained global trade. The vast horizon symbolized both opportunity and vulnerability. Each voyage was a demonstration of imperial reach. But while Blenheim carried out her missions, technology advanced with relentless speed. The naval arms race of the early 20th century changed the rules. The introduction of dreadnought-type battleships redefined maritime power. The balance between range, speed, and armament was reassessed. Ships built under one strategic logic became obsolete under another. Launched in 1890 as a modern cruiser, Blenheim became, in less than 20 years, a vessel of a previous generation. She did not fail. She aged. And in military history, that is a common fate. When she was sold for scrap in 1907, there was no final battle. There was a strategic decision. The steel that had crossed oceans was dismantled. The structure that had supported hundreds of men was cut apart and repurposed. But that does not erase her significance. Blenheim belonged to the moment just before the definitive rupture of the 20th century. She sailed in an era when the British Empire seemed permanent, when cruisers dispersed across the globe were believed sufficient to sustain imperial order. Only a few years later, the First World War would demonstrate that the sea had become an industrialized battlefield. Submarines, mines, and blockades would radically transform naval warfare. Blenheim did not take part in that war. But she was part of the transition that preceded it. She represents the intermediate period, between Victorian confidence and the industrial brutality of modern warfare. The Indian Ocean she crossed remains vast. Routes have changed, flags have changed, empires have changed. But the logic remains: whoever controls the sea influences the world. Ships come and go. Technologies evolve. Empires rise and decline. Blenheim did not sink in mystery. She disappeared in change. And perhaps that is the quietest and most revealing form of disappearance in naval history. If you've made it this far, it means this story, quiet, distant, almost forgotten, has made you see the sea differently. HMS Blenheim did not end in an explosion. She did not become a dramatic headline. But she represented an entire era of naval history. And that is exactly what this channel aims to show. Not only the great battles but the moments of transition, the forgotten ships, the stories that shaped the world without almost anyone noticing. If you enjoy diving deep into military and naval history, with real context, verified facts, and immersive storytelling, this is the place for you. So take a moment now. Leave a like. It truly helps the channel continue bringing stories like this. And subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Because the sea holds many stories still untold. And we are only just beginning.